Brazil. Baiocchi, who is one of the founders of Participatory Budgeting Project, recently published the book, The Imagination Civic, where he analyzed the limits of democratic dialogue in the United States. Welcome, Professor Gianpaolo. Welcome, Professor Marcelo. For reasons, very strategic reasons, each speaker will have strictly up to 30 minutes because Professor Gianpaolo is about to travel, so we can't speak too long, and due to a mutual agreement, Professor Marcelo is going to begin his talk before Professor Gianpaolo. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to share the table with Gianpaolo, with whom we have kept up a discussion for a long time, ever since we were doing our PhD and we met. And my intervention is, to a certain extent, to continue the discussion we had this morning. I'm going to analyze a bit of this relation between contestation and institutionalization, which is the topic of this table, from a recent trajectory in Brazil, and obviously having as a framework from which one should problematize this relation the cycle of protests of last year. In fact, our guests from abroad must have realized that the cycle of protests of 2013 in Brazil had a certain traumatic effect on us in social sciences, and to a great extent due to the huge difficulty we had and still have of understanding what really happened. So I'd like to begin with this and thus give rise to a discussion about the relationship between contestation and institutionalization. Well, I have called this cycle of protests of 2013. 2013-14 really, but I think his name was better than Days of July or whatever other Days of June or other things that are circulating in society, because it avoids unifying a process that has as its great characteristic diversity, heterogeneity, and more than everything, internal conflicts, which constituted what happened, and it's a mark that makes it difficult for us to understand it. So the cycle of protests of 2013 surprised one for several reasons. The magnitude, the phenomenon that happened on a national scale, although it was not a single process on a national scale, the speed at which it happened in May, there was no one who could foresee what would happen in June. In July, we already have the decline of the dynamic of the protest, the novelty and diversity of the segments of the population mobilized. As Luciana said this morning, a significant part of the participants do not have any experience of engagement, militancy, or continued development with demonstrations. The violence of some of the repertories used, which was also discussed this morning, there was a change, at least in part, to traditional patterns and how public performance occur in Brazilian demonstration and so on. So there was a number of characteristics that produced this surprise. One of the reasons for surprise that I'd like to mention refers to the break that the cycle of protests promoted in a diagnosis which until last year was more or less general in the country. This diagnosis pointed to a tendency to diminish the extra-institutional contestation in Brazil due to the growing institutionalization of organizations of social movements in the last 3 decades, especially from 2003 on with the Lula administration. This diagnosis of the decline of the contestatory dynamics in the country can be found with 3 bases from which this interpretation occurred, that we would see growing institutionalization and diminished contestation. First, according also to what was discussed this morning, one of the readings about the process emphasized that the growing opening of opportunities for institutional participation for social organization in the context of post-democratization, the councils, conferences, participatory budgets, participation of organizations organizations to implement public policies, they tend to generate a natural or rational displacement of extra and anti-institutional contestatory practices for institutional action, since now there will be real opportunities to express demands and proposals through the institutional channels available. Why protest if now it's possible to participate in the discussion, formulation, deliberation, implementation, and evaluation process for public policies? To a large extent, a significant part of the discussion of participatory democracy was marked to a certain extent by this diagnosis, and many of the actors involved had this idea. A second idea that moves us diagnosis about the decline of contestation with institutionalization is another argument in another field of actors and also analysts of social sciences, which will emphasize that institutionalization was an inevitable mechanism for demobilization and at the limit to co-optation of the organization of social movements, which then becomes submitted to the logical intentionality of the political forces of governments. This will necessarily lead to abandoning the contestatory forms of action. That is, this is a discussion that comes from the beginning of the 80s, when this possibility arose for the first time, or one started to discuss institutional participation. And with the growth of participatory institutions and so on, this debate on the risks of institutional participation and how it could be a mechanism for co-optation and control of social organizations was very strong. I worked at the NGO at the beginning of the 90s, and one field of participants of militants of this NGO really criticized the participatory budget, which in those days called the risk that the participatory budget would bring to qualified clientelism. One had to fight, and that is what transforms and changes things. They say that struggle changes life. So this is also institutional participation in itself has this effect of co-optation. And finally, the third argument that I would like to mention in this diagnosis of institutionalization emphasizes the capture of, especially beginning with Lula's government, by social organizations that took over sectors of the state and then enjoyed public funds for their reproduction, and would tend to take on a position that is not confrontational and to defend the government benefits. Literature now says that the involvement of social organizations in the national institution would tend to bring back traditional practices of private appropriation, corruption, and these different arguments are very distinct, and they are opposed in some cases, but institutional participation and institutionalization are mutually excluding. And particularly the first will go down, and who participates does not contest things, and who contests does not participate. And so there was this idea that possibly after the intensification of the possibilities of participation in the rural government, the extra-institutional contestation should be something that was residual and declining. The field of studies of social movements and conflicts in Brazilian social science has diminished in the last decades. Why should we have social movements? It's not going to work anymore. I heard this sentence, and we need to study we need to study what's residual and what's going to end soon. And then we have the cycle of protests of 2013, and actually no one could understand really what was happening. So I think that now we have an opportunity that is very interesting in the cycle and all this confusion and perplexity that it generated. There was already a field of studies in Brazil that was outstanding, and we have to rethink in a more complex manner the relations between institutional and contestatory politics, to break this idea that they're necessarily opposed. They may be, but they're not necessarily so. and advance in the understanding that they are alternatives that under certain specific conditions can come together in a very diverse form, creating a continuum of possibilities in which the options of a contestatory action which is completely outside institutions and complete institutional insertion are extreme cases. Among these extremes, we have a diversity of combinations, including organizations of social movements which tend to displace themselves based on changes in organizational and contextual aspects, functions. In this sense, Godwin and Lee present the argument in a proposition of a contextual political analysis is that the relationship between context and politics depends. Institutionalization, as Adrian mentioned, one depends on how contestation and institutionalization are related. Empirically, it depends on organization and contextual conditions beside contingencies that are very specific. I think one of the difficulties that we have to explain what happened last year is that a major part of this is explained by contingencies that were not foreseen and occurred. In order to illustrate the complexity of these relations in Brazil, I would like to tell two recent cases which illustrate the difficulty to think about these relations. In 2011, several here must remember 51 militants of various organizations of social movements such as the landless people, unemployed people, popular consultation and Via Campesina had an act of collective break with their organizations, launching an open letter that denounced a process of growing institutionalization and the abandonment of more contestatory forms. These militants denounced in the open letter, quote, now what organizations need is managers, technicians and bureaucrats, and not militants who will expose the contradictions and drive the struggle. In the same period, we were doing a survey on the involvement of organizations of social movements in implementing public policies, and one interviewee who was from one of these organizations answered the criticism of the open letter, saying that those militants didn't understand that it was exactly the institutional insertion of the organizations, if the cause, which allowed mobilizing the resources and made it possible to develop contestatory actions by these organizations. In other words, for this interview, on the contrary of having a contradiction between institutionalization and contestation, it was the capacity to support the continuous contestation on a national scale by this organization was made possible by the capacity to occupy additional spaces and getting funds through this. So this potential. And another case that is even more interesting, on the 14th of June 2013, within the cycle of protests of last year, a group of demonstrators of the homeless workers movement gathered in Brasilia for an act that was called World Cup for Whom. One of their targets was the expenditure of public funds to hold the Confederation Cup, which would begin the next day after the demonstration. These demonstrators closed the important avenue in Brasilia with tires to which they set fire, and they hold up the traffic for more than an hour until the police intervened to take them off the roadbed. After the protest, sectors of investigation of the police checked who had organized this action, and then it was through this investigation and partly to finding out who bought the tires and paid the transport to take them there. One identified the participation of people who worked in the presidency of Brazil, in an agency of the Brazilian presidency, and who had participated in organizing this demonstration. In other words, a set of young activists with connections to student movements, NGOs, a history with political parties, and at that moment they were occupying positions in the president's office. So in these two cases, and I think the second is more dramatic, show we could multiply these cases. There are many cases that are complex, and they identify forms of intersection between institutionalized politics and contestatory politics, which does not fit our traditional models of study in social sciences, but often are not part of the social and political discourse of the militants with whom we speak day to day. They are examples of the complex intersections between organizations of social movements in contemporary Brazil, and they challenge us and are a central point of our agenda for investigation in Brazil today. Through the very different mechanisms, holding public positions, and here for our foreign guests, it's important to explain that in Brazil things have changed a bit based on the war from Lula's government, but there is a figure called position of trust, and it's possible to appoint people who do not belong to the state to occupy positions of the state based on this indication. So this allows some hundreds of, and some cases, some thousands of individuals can go from society to the state, from the market to the state, in a very intensive form at every changing government in the country. And obviously this is an important mechanism through which militants come in and go out of the state in a very intensive manner in Brazil. So the occupation of public positions and the election of activists to the legislature and judiciary and the participation in things, in demonstrations that mobilize millions of people, and the implementation of public policies in several other forms allows activists from organizations of social movements, to use a term by Tula Ferretti, to infiltrate the state, and without necessarily abandoning the extra-institutional contestation, can explore and use the opportunities for institutional action. And in many cases, this creates a pattern of relationship which was called conflictive participation. It's a relation which once the interviewee talked about very clearly when I asked what the relationship was of the organization with the federal government. He said, we are uncomfortable friends. As we're friends, we have a participation, but we do not give up the conflict and pressure and contestation. So, these cases place for discussion two basic assumptions that structured the field of studies of social movements in Brazil. On the one hand, an assumption that movements and organizations of a social nature necessarily have an externality relation with the state or with the institutional policy. And on the other hand, the assumption of confrontation, that is, confrontation is or should be the form of action par excellence, and maybe the only form of action of social movements. These were two assumptions that marked our discussion in Brazil for a certain time, and that to a certain extent still continue to guide our debate. To problematize these assumptions and advance and understand this diversity and dynamics of relations between contestation and institutionalization, it seems to me that one important aspect which I will focus on mainly, I think that's what we in the literature and discussion of social movements have worked on least. There's an aspect that is the need to break with a significant gap that exists in relations between social movements and political parties in the literature of social movements, especially in Brazil. And this topic in Brazil was generally relegated to the background as though it were not important or as though it were taboo and should not be discussed directly by the researchers. This is particularly serious in the Brazilian case because relations of intersection between parties, and particularly the Workers' Party, but not only. This relation of an intersection between parties and social organizations tend to present a great centrality in shaping the social the associative fabric of Brazil, particularly of the social movements. And this intersection and the way it is built in Brazil, based on the process of democratization, was a very specific moment in Brazilian political history, and it tends not to be very adapted to the typologies we have to think about the relations between parties and social movements. Michael Hannigan has a typology in which he presents 5 types of relations: articulation, infiltration, alliance, independence, and competition, but all of them tend to keep a certain separation, a clear separation between parties and organization of certain movements. The Brazilian case, this intersection, it means a co-constitution of these actors. And Misch has a very interesting study on Jewish movements in Brazil and the process of redemocratization from then on. And she called this in Brazil multiple militancy, which would be characteristic exactly of this action of significant number of activists in Brazil who are part of and develop their activism in various social organizations, but also in political parties, creating connections and superpositions between these spheres of action, and in certain cases leading to a relative dilution of their borders. In the 70s, for instance, the idea of activism involved activism in social organization, activism in unions and in parties, and all this was seen as part of broader action to create a more structural or radical transformation of society, whether it be in the terms of the idea of revolution or the idea of liberation, of radical sectors of popular Catholicism. But anyhow, there was this idea that all were instruments that together came united to reach a greater objective. That is, it did not make sense to ask people whether militants of the party, of the union, of the movement, or of the association, or of the religious group. They belong to all, and this is what gave the activism sense. So it's precisely this intersection between the party and movement, which together with other mechanisms that I'm not going to discuss, allows not only to understand this dimension taken on by the incorporation of an institution between organizations and social movements in Brazil in the last decades, but it also helps explain how this incorporation is occurring. What Libanassak calls the intersection between state and movement. So this interpenetration between activists who are in the state and are in the movement and circulate in this space of social fields, precisely this according to their activism. In other words, on the one hand, with selection of a candidate from a political party in which they militate, the people, that is, the people who are members of social movements militate, and some of them are themselves elected. This significantly changes the opportunities for institutional access, not only for the activists, but also their organizations and movements. For instance, the progressive electoral victories of a party like the Workers' Party in Brazil, whose strong root in an articulation intersection with associative fabric, allowed growing groups to have access to the university and the state with high degree of permeability to their demands and proposals. Obviously, the election in 2003 was a high point of this process. On the other hand, due to the penetration of the party and movement, this institutional incorporation is not characterized only by the opening or permeability of demands and proposals of social movements, but also by the recurrence of a central mechanism in conforming this permeability. The idea that the individuals circulate in the social organizations to the government, from the government to NGOs, from NGOs to technical teams of political organizations very intensively and very fast. And it is possible because these individuals are militants of organizations and movements, but also party militants, and this allows circulating through the space. So this circulation is greatly enabled by this interpretation between parties and movements. Victories, electoral victories and defeats tend to produce a significant transit of militants of civil society to government and vice versa. generating quick, intense changes in the opportunities of institutional access. So this emphasis on the centrality of institutional transit as a mechanism of permeability between social movement and state, creating a picture of expressive intersection between states and movements, appears to be an argument that is analytically fruitful to break with simplistic approaches that ignore complex relationships between social organizations, political parties, and state in Brazil. And this occurs mainly through the displacement and sharing of activists, militants, and so on. To close, going back to the cycle of protests in 2013 and again dialoguing directly with this morning's discussion, I think that as a hypothesis we might see this as the first great cycle of protests of a new context, in which for the first time since the 1980s, the Workers' Party is no longer the great articulator of mobilized social forces, and is replaced and confronted by various organizations and segments of society which not only do not identify with the Workers' Party, but are openly against their actions at the head of the federal government. In other words, the pattern of intersection constituted in the 1980s appears to be changing or has exhausted the cycle in the last few years. And this helps understand the reconfiguration of the process of organization and social mobilization for contestation in the country. I would like to explain two things so that you do not miss the complexity of the current political context. On the one hand, this does not mean that segments articulated around the PT were not important agents in constructing the 2003 cycle of protests. The case I told of the demonstration in Brasilia is shaped by activists and militants of the Workers' Party. And it does not mean also that the Workers' Party has broadly lost its centrality in conforming Brazilian associativism. The more traditional organization of social movements, even with various conflicts and tensions, still have a strong intersection with the Workers' Party. All we have to do is look at the candidates in last elections. We'll identify those of the landless people, of the farmers' movement, of the homeless movement, of the Central Union of Workers, and so this does not mean that the Workers' Party is no longer important, but there are new actors and new dynamics that have made the game more complex. On the other hand, also, second point, one must look at the profound heterogeneity of the social and political forces which confront and continue confronting this Workers' Party field. This was may be divided in a very simplifying way, on the one hand, between a field of actors who criticize the limits of the advances of the Workers' Party governments in creating structural changes in Brazilian society. Now there's a field of actors now who identify in the Workers' Party administration frustration. It should have gone further with changes in Brazilian society and did not. And they problematize and stress the Workers' Party and its governments by this confrontation. On the other hand, this may be one of the great surprises of the cycle of protests last year, a field of actors that is emerged that react strongly to changes or to the threats of changes produced by the Workers' Party administrations. These two segments were on the streets in 2013. Both segments channeled the mobilizations to the electoral process of 2014. These two segments will probably continue the process of contestation, which is complex and plural, in the coming years. So, since both segments were on the streets in 2013, sometimes at the same demonstrations, and this simultaneous presence has been responsible precisely for these completely different and contradictory expressions about what happened last year. What was the political significance of what happened? On one hand, some authors thought of the idea of a coup, a right-wing coup that was ongoing. There was a journalist of the state who was a very big insertion in this field of alternative press, who wrote an article in mid-2013 saying that that it's a crowd captured by a fascist group. That was one idea. The other idea was a popular revolution. And we had a debate in this room that was exactly this. On the one hand, we said something, some others said other things. And the meeting of our main Association of Social Sciences this year, there were several panels about the protests, and the analysis are completely contradictory. But I think that is for this reason. It wasn't a process, it was several processes whose characteristic and was exactly diversity of groups that mobilize and refer to each other but are not the same movement, and that I think is a question of interest. So to finish, I would like to emphasize that to understand processes such as the dynamics of Brazilian institutionalization and not necessarily abandon the contestation or the protest cycle of 2013, which involves partly actors who have a strong participation in institutions. We must qualify treatment of the complex dynamics and sometimes relations between traditional systems, focusing, besides other aspects, on the configurations of political parties and organization of social movements. I think that the sort of hurried arguments that have been presented here help advance in this sense.
Thank you, Professor Marcelo. I give the floor immediately to Professor Gianpaolo. First, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for welcoming us so warmly in these days. I know that organizing these international events is something that is always very complicated. We have very guests from outside that book flights at very inconvenient times, so I apologize on my own behalf right away. I have a great affection for this university. I don't belong to this house, but I consider myself a friend of this house, and my intellectual and political trajectory is connected to Portugal. It's always very gratifying to be with you. It's really very nice to get to know the next generation of social scientists. It was very nice to be able to talk with Marcelo's work group in these past days. It was really very gratifying. And also, from a certain point of view, it is very gratifying also to see an institution like this having such a protagonism in this internationalization of knowledge. So congratulations for all these reasons. I was invited to talk about a topic about which I wouldn't be the right person to talk about. The most appropriate choice. There are people here in the room who are much more qualified and knowledgeable than us, but I'm going to play a trick for that reason. I'm going to continue the conversation that we started this morning after Marcelo's talk, and my idea would be this. I was invited to make a comparative analysis and to talk a little about the Occupy movement. Although my work is mainly about Brazil, I now have done some work on the US too, but not about that movement. So I came here to make a few reflections leading our discussion towards a comparison between these movements that have occurred all over the world in recent years. There are people who are more qualified and more sober than myself, like Donatello, for instance, who could do this in a better way. But anyway, let's go ahead. I'm going to start by disagreeing respectfully from Professor Alessandro, who spoke yesterday. He said something very, very briefly in the beginning of his talk and said, these are not his words, but my interpretation. This debate about post-political, you think it's very facile, too simple to talk about Jutla and Chantal Mouffe, these people who talk about this post-political condition that apparently we are experiencing, or at least according to them. He put that aside and moved to another analysis. I think, beginning with the post-political, I think it is an interesting issue because it is an empirical issue, actually. So in my comments, I'm going to push our talk in this direction. There is a method of an English scholar of ours called John Law. He talks a lot about empirical philosophy. Sociologists should do empirical philosophy. What is that? We should think not whether the normative theories are true, but we should pay attention to the normative theories through which people live and justify their common life or their life together. So the post-political, to which Gianpaolo Baiocchi and others refer to, does have an empirical reference. People do talk about the post-political moment. The apathy, the distancing from politics is something real, both in Brazil and in the US and in Europe. And on the basis of that, if we were to make a comparison between the movements Occupy, the Indignados, that's called Days of June, I think there would be three conceptual keys. There would be three conceptual keys that I would like to raise. First, I think this is a circulation of instruments or tools that are more or less similar in different contexts and with very different imaginaries. So let's talk about these three things: imaginary, context, and circulation. And also I'm going to make reference to works by others. I'm going to conclude making some methodological reflections if I have enough time. First, the imaginary. I'm going to refer to a book that I wrote with colleagues from a work group which we launched at the beginning of the year, which is called Civic Imagination. And this was a work that we did on the political daily life of Americans. This was an ethnographic work in which we tried to understand this post-political, whether the post-political was true. So in this work we began, you always need a puzzle. People in the States say that we need a puzzle, and there was a puzzle, which was this. In the surveys, people reject politics brutally, and more so than ever. The evaluation of a professional politician in the U.S. is, and this is a true data, it's worse than having your teeth fixed or than having the evaluation of insects. The mafia and the politicians have similar evaluations. But on the other hand, people continue to be involved, and even after 2008, more than before. So today we talk about a generation of young activists that are more active than in the 1960s, although the surveys continue to show that rejection. So the book dealt with this issue. How can you understand the imaginary? What is the thinkable and the unthinkable for people in this involvement, in this commitment? So we ended up talking about the denegation of politics. And the denegation, this is a German word by Freud, but denegation is this act of rejecting and not rejecting at the same time. Denegation in psychoanalysis is something so traumatic that you cannot accept it, but it's so big that you cannot deny it. So you have this kind of yes-no relationship with it. And people denegate politics in the U.S. It's something constant in our work. The normal analysis, the usual analysis that comes from these currents of the post-political, say that this is a symptom of this moment where we live, in which democracy is not a true democracy. People are alienated, people don't have access to the decisions that affect their lives, and that's why they reject politics. And we are without way out. We have no way out. I have just a few notes here. I shouldn't have read them, actually. He said actually we were fucked up. So, in our case, what we found, this denegation was a highly optimistic act. It was a ritual act that people performed in order to create a space of civil society or voluntary participation, a pure space, not contaminated by politics. So it's expressed in a very interesting way the will that people had, the desire for genuine action. So it was not. They just wanted to turn their backs to democracy. It was, to a great extent, because they wanted a better democracy. The danger, however, of this view of the negation of politics is that it is impossible to think about an action that would reform the political context, because it's something dirty. It's very difficult to talk about inequality, something that we saw both in the spaces that we shared with activists and also at other moments. It was very difficult to think about these two things, although people did want a space of pure action. The Occupy movement occurred a few months after we completed our study, and we saw that very clearly, and the surveys that colleagues of ours conducted with activists of the Occupy movement showed that. In other words, people rejected the political institutions brutally. They did want a better democracy, a true democracy, but in our case in the U.S., there wasn't a way out. There wasn't much in terms of way out. So in contrast with the indignados, in contrast even with things that occurred here in Brazil, the Occupy movement ended up, in my view, ended up having very little result. One of the few things that survived from the Occupy were self-help works. After this storm in New York, Sandy in New York, there was a self-help movement turning their backs to the state and to institutions. So when we talk about these movements, which occurred in various contexts, we should ask, what is the imaginary, what is the thinkable and the unthinkable for these people? That's the first question I'd like to raise. The second word, is context. Brun Latour says that context is a dirty, ugly, and lazy word. When you're talking about context, you're actually not talking about other things that you should be talking about. And I share this position with Marcelo and the previous speakers, this position of relational sociology. My work about Porto Alegre in the 90s and beginning of the years 2000, the work that we did with Marcelo on cities with and without participatory budgeting, shares this position. In other words, we try to rethink institutions, movements, entities based on networks. We prioritize relationships, so we try to disaggregate or open the black boxes, as the French would put it, and we try to look into practices, networks, institutions that make up these groups. The relational sociology, this is an ugly word, is non-substantialist. In other words, when we're talking about collective actors or parties or movements or governments, we shouldn't talk about a substance that there would be in there. Even we should think about networks that make it up. Instead of talking about Workers' Party, we should sometimes talk about the networks of people acting as the Workers' Party and on behalf of the Workers' Party. Because this is something multiple, complicated, hybrid, porous in the Brazilian context. This is very conspicuous. I'm going to tell a joke. Do we have time for a joke? So remember relational sociology. You have heard this joke, certainly. There aren't so many about this. But I always do this in the classroom. Do you remember that a racist television program, Zorro, in which is Zorro, and there was his colleague, Long Ranger. So Zorro went up there to a hill and were surrounded by a group of Comanche warriors. And Zorro tried to come in and said, we are surrounded by Indians. What does we mean in this case, Long Ranger? So this is the essence, in my view, of relational sociology. What does we mean? What does party mean? Who is calling that in this way? In the case of the so-called Days of June, there was a contestation, and there's still a contestation about what is that. And to talk about an object constituted with a single logic can be useful at certain moments, but it is a political act of creating and we and ourselves another one. The Occupy movement at the beginning, this is something that we experienced in the social networks, was not a single thing. There was an intense debate, but it did catch. The media began to call it Occupy, other occupiers appeared, and so it went. But these continue to be acts of social agencies, or of calling that an agent. Relational sociology asks us to open up and think about how these agents were constituted. The third key is the circulation of instruments or tools. We could use repertoires, tactics. I prefer to talk about instruments, because instruments are things that travel, circulate over the world, but they are not neutral in their effect. They are almost neutral, but they do have impacts. Instruments carry with themselves a worldview and end up having sometimes unexpected effects. When we think about these movements since 2011, it's worthwhile to recall three kinds of circulation of instruments. First one, of course, the movement connected to the World Social Forum, the movements for another world, in which circulated ideas and texts about organizing assemblies that you can trace back directly to Occupy, to the Indignados, for instance. But beginning in the years 2000, there is something else that circulates, which are the participatory instruments that are everywhere. And now I quote, if you have questions, you can ask Professor Ganuza, Ernesto Ganuza, who is the source of this information. But beginning in the years 2000, mainly, with the changes in nation states, in the global north, but also in the south, people begin to talk about governance instead of government. There's a strong emphasis on public governance. Citizens begin to occupy a very privileged space. There is no project in Europe or in the States or in Brazil that does not have this character, the figure of the citizen in the middle of it. And this is fed by participatory tactics and practices that are circulating all the time. An interesting fact is this: in Spain, the rates of rejection of political institutions are very high. But Spain, just as Brazil, is a very participatory country. The number of municipalities in Spain that have participatory practices, spaces of participation, is almost 100%. They participate everywhere. I thought that Brazil was the most participatory country because there are millions of people who attended popular consultations, conferences, congresses, and so forth. And we can find the same techniques, the same practices. Today there is a whole world of people who are experts in participation who travel all over the world and make these practices circulate. I can talk a little about the circulation of participatory budgeting all over the world. I can even talk about New York and Chicago if you're interested. But there is a third circulation going on too, which is the circulation of specific tactics, symbols, and practice specific of the movements, beginning with 15M in Spain. There were people, individuals, who took the practices of holding assemblies from Spain to the U.S., horizontal practice, rejection of political parties, the symbology. I don't know whether anybody remembers, but there was in Brazil some occupiers in 2012. I even had contact with a little assembly in which they were directly inspired by Occupy. But the context, the imaginary, was different, so this did not catch. But these things are circulating. I also think that we should not forget, sometimes in our more politicized utterances, we make a distinction between these practices of government over against practices of movements. But actually, this is a very mixed world. Often the specialists, the experts are the same ones. I remember a colleague whom I know who is an expert, who works for the World Bank, doing participatory budgeting, went to Spain at the beginning of the 15M to teach classes on participatory budgeting, and then went to make promotion of democracy in the Arab world, which is his main work now. And this is a person who comes from movement, so it's a very mixed world. This also carries with it a certain ambiguity. Now, a few methodological reflections. How should we do that? Now I'm going to sell my fish, as people say in Brazil. I'm going to talk a little bit about ethnography, about comparison, and perhaps a little more about the creation of actors. I think that one of the things that we could take more seriously in our comparative work would be the attention to meanings, to justifications, and not to assume always that Occupy, the days of June are the same thing. I think that careful ethnographic work has a lot to add. Besides that, I think that in these works we should be more carefully in the following of actors who cross various worlds. For those who come from outside Brazil, it's a little difficult to explain, because you take them to an organization of civil society, and half a dozen people there are of the government, the other 5 people are of the party, and there is one person who is neither one of them, and there's a cleansing in that place. This is very interesting. In the 1990s, we used to talk about multiple activism or militancy, but this is very characteristic and specific of Brazil. So when we move to the comparisons, we should be careful about this. I also think now, following what Marcelo said, this would not be only ethnographies of assemblies. I think that a mistake that we make from the old ones that work on participation is this. The first one, you attend an assembly and you sit down with the participants and watch who raises their hands, who talks. But there are thousands of interesting things there. Who organized the assembly? Why are the chairs arranged the way they are? Who called these people? And you should follow people inside and outside the assembly, because the assembly is easiest. And I have always arguments with my students because they want to cover the assemblies in a post-occupied. But I think the most interesting things occur around the assemblies. And I think there is a gap in this respect. I don't know whether you all agree with me, but I think that we could also break a little bit ontological complicity. My theory to explain the gap about the Workers' Party in the studies on participation in Brazil is that many, and I include myself in that, many of the scholars were partisans in the ontological sense, not that they were militants of a party or activists, but when you got there and you saw it, things through the eyes of the organizer. We thought about the success of organizations on the basis of the success defined by the protagonists. And I think there are interesting things. This does not mean a non-politicized sociology, a neutral sociology, nothing of that. But we should take a distance ourselves a little from the worldviews. Second point has to do with comparison. I think that we should be more careful. We could be more careful. We could make the comparisons in a more careful manner when comparing countries. The easiest thing is to say, well, it's like this, Spain is like that, the US is like that, and that's it. But when you compare things, these are independent things, and these are realities that come one after the other, and are somewhat mixed. I don't know whether the nation-state would be the best unit. I think that we could have comparisons within. We could have comparisons between kinds of things. I personally find it very interesting to compare and to think about these instruments of participation the ideas, for instance, but we shouldn't stick to the nation state. And third, and my last methodological reflection is this. I think, returning to the story of Zorro and the Long Ranger, I think... Long Ranger and Zorro. Tonto. We as social scientists are part of the picture, both in Brazil and the U.S. When we begin to describe a collective actor as such, we help to create a collective actor as such. These are performative acts. The actor begins to exist at the moment when we start calling them like this. So I think that there are many fights, interesting fights, controversies and contestations in the breaches, in the moments when collective actors are created. Sometimes when we move up in this case, Occupy was even a creation of a company that makes the advertisement, Adbusters. They began to call it Occupy.
Ok.
Certo.
Mas não foi uma criação de militantes.
But it was not a creation of activists always. But then Occupy began to spread. Then it caught.
Aí começaram a ter vários Occupy.
So various Occupies began to take place. We had in Washington, in New York, we had the Rosh Hashanah Occupy, which is a Jewish holiday, Rosh Hashanah. Then we have the root Occupy, which comes of Occupy the ghetto, calling attention to the fact that the main Occupy on a park was beginning to become very homogeneous. Was it a single banner or not? I think these are interesting elements for analysis and for comparison. Thank you very much.
Vamos abrir então para as perguntas, né?
Now for questions, I would only like to explain that the questions through internet can also come to us, right? Right?
Só um pouquinho, vamos fazer, só um segundinho, vamos fazer uma...
Says we're going to have a round of registrations and then we'll answer. Anyone else in the first? We have enough people registering for the first round, right? First two? We begin there, Victor. Good afternoon, Professor Baiocchi, Professor Kunrath. I thank you for your communication. And the question is about what Professor Baiocchi mentioned about the need to pay more attention to the meanings produced by the actors. And in this sense, I would like you to make some remarks about what you would think of the aesthetic key for the understanding of the phenomena of mobilization in Brazil. There was a lot of humor and laughter was present before the Monday mobilization, I think June 17. People were joking about the revolution of vinegar because we were arrested because you had vinegar with you and how one can resist the gases of the police. And your comment about Occupy being the product of a company, actually I did not know this. But I think it's funny they come to the street, came from a band of cars that was appropriated and re-signified. So that's the question. Next is Vanessa. Well, my question is to Gianpaolo. I'd like to know, Gianpaolo, more about Occupy, which you said to us why you think that this movement in a way declined. Because, I don't know, but talking with a few activists of the indignant front and of the students movement of Chile. The topic was how can you influence in government without belonging to a party and without being part of a traditional party. Occupy actually they did something very interesting in a street militancy with Free University, and then after a year they had a May Day. The motto was we are 99%, and this did not manage. What's the explanation? Do they depend? Don't they want to influence politics in the government or anything like that? What is your justification hypothesis for this decline? Eu concordo, muito obrigado por sua apresentação. Concordo com tanto o Marcelo como o Gianpaolo, que termos antipolíticos e pós-políticos levam a erro, mas eu acho que nós, pelo menos, temos que nos considerar culpados do fato de que, de fato, as primeiras visões desses movimentos, dos movimentos em 2011 e depois, nos empurraram para apontar uma situação. Eles disseram, nós às vezes precisamos nós não somos nem de direita nem de esquerda, disseram que você vai a todos ou não, ninguém nos representa, mas é verdade que inesperadamente foram muito abertos para a entrada na política, e eu acho que, além daquilo que você apresentou, também há outros casos de capacidade extraordinária de entrar na política institucional. E isso foi participação em referendos, ou na Catalunha, o pseudo-referendo, foi assim que se desenvolveu. Dentro dos novos partidos que vêm dos movimentos Siriza, Podemos, ganhamos e etc. Esses estão fora do que acontece no Brasil, mas Occupy, ocupação, na Itália, significou também ocupe o Partido Democrata. Então, houve um movimento semelhante lá e também na Turquia depois. Então, ativistas dos seus próprios partidos na crítica ao destacamento dos partidos em relação às opiniões. Mas a minha pergunta é mais orientada para tipologias, porque minha impressão é que os movimentos sempre interagiram com política institucional, mas em formas diferentes. No passado, houve militância múltipla ou dupla, tipicamente movimento trabalhista no movimento e nos partidos, sindicalismo e militantes de partidos e assim por diante. Porto Alegre teve o Fórum Social Mundial, que introduziu um tipo diferente de relação com os partidos. Foi mais baseado em uma divisão de trabalho também na Europa. Então, havia corretagem nos partidos, mas havia percepção moderna que dizia que as organizações de movimentos sociais fizeram algo, e algumas coisas e os partidos, outras depois. Houve, mesmo os partidos feministas na Suécia tiveram sucesso inesperado e parece ter um tipo de substituição lógica. Então, como não há nada que sobre, como há um vazio, há oportunidades muito abertas, porque todo o resto está caindo, então eles estão ocupando esses espaços. E talvez esse tipo de tipologias poderiam ajudar a compreender as diferenças entre aquilo que podia ser a relação entre o PT no Brasil e movimentos sociais daqueles vistos no sul da Europa. Professor Marcelo to go back to the discussion. This morning, Professor Lavalli talked about the anti-system agenda present in the protest, and I see that at that time there were groups that were really anti-system, and others that used the agenda to, their anti-system was actually the anti-system which one has nowadays in the federal government. They're anti-system, but they would like to be in the system and remove those who are currently in the system. And I ask you whether at this time, post-2013, there has been a process of publicization of this real anti-system position which deep down thinks only about removing the current group and placing themselves in the place of the ones they will remove. I'm Thaddeus. I'm a small... I'm sorry, I hope that I'm not being irrelevant, but anyhow, my question is about two phenomena of the two experiences in 2013. One is, despite the interinstitutional character of these processes, there was discourse that wanted to show that the movement did not belong to any party, to such a point that it was interpreted as an anti-party movement. And that's interesting because there was a rejection on the scale. The other is an answer to strong repression to these events. There were two events in Puerto Rico. One was the occupation of the main square, government square, and the other was the occupation of the city council. And I'd like to know your interpretation of these phenomena, whether it was the influence of Occupy or a response to violence and rethinking the method. That's what I wanted to know. Thank you. Eu realmente não tenho a pergunta, mas em vez de um comentário sobre a palestra do Marcelo. Você tomou uma atitude contra aqueles que estão estritamente separando o Estado por um lado e os movimentos do outro. Eu acho que basicamente tem razão em dizer que isto é uma relação muito mais complexa, e eu acho que há diferentes padrões se comparar com o tempo e comparar com os lugares. Então, por um lado, há situações onde há uma sobreposição significativa entre o Estado e os movimentos sociais. Há outras situações em que o Estado e os movimentos são estritamente separados. Em 68, eu acho que praticamente não houve cooperação entre o Estado e os movimentos sociais, daquilo que eu pude ver. Depois, há uma situação em que o mesmo movimento se desloca da situação de separação estrita para a cooperação ou algo semelhante. Também há essa literatura sobre feminismo, feministas que entram no Estado e continuam a ser ativas como feministas radicais dentro do Estado. E, às vezes, também há um movimento na direção oposta. Então, movimento e atores que se tornaram integrados nas agências do Estado finalmente descobrem que não podem ser muito eficazes nesse contexto, e então param e voltam aos movimentos. O último aspecto é o fato da cooperação. De novo, é muito difícil generalizar, e você não generalizou. Por um lado, pode ser que a cooperação entre movimentos e estados realmente fortaleça o movimento e empodera o movimento com dinheiro e recursos e assim por diante. Mas também pode ser exatamente o contrário, que os atores do movimento, agindo dentro do Estado, são cooptados, o movimento se torna mais fraco, fica domesticado, assim por dizer. Então, essa é uma relação complexa e tem de ser considerado com o tempo e com o aspecto do lugar. Não se pode generalizar uma situação e dizer que é assim que essa relação é. Would also like to talk about the relation between social movements and the parties. in the discussion by Marcelo. And indeed, I think that we still have a very big approach between the movements, including the popular movements and the Workers' Party, those that were born together in the mid-70s. But the impression I have, Marcelo said, the sense of these connections changed extremely, especially after the Ming Salong corruption thing. There was a big defeat of the ethical party for the first time in the history of this country, and the defeat of politics, which was the second time at this election. And it was really marked things. I remember 2 weeks ago I was at an assembly of these popular movements, and the representative of the General Secretariat of the Presidency came and spoke to the movement and said, we've got to go to the street to defend this government. We have to go to the street to defend our government. It's on the streets that we will defend against the right. And this was very clearly said, and there was no difference. In fact, you're right, I clearly saw this. However, when you go to talk with the leaders who were there against them and against the government, when you talk with them, they say, our stupid were to wake up at 2 in the morning to put up posters of the party without any pay. We would never do this today. There's a dimension of this relationship that I think makes a great difference, and I think it's important to discuss this a bit further. I like the way Gianpaolo says that we have a tendency and a wish to compare, so the Brazilian Spring, the Arab Spring, the Spanish Spring, but anyhow, these are very different processes. Anyhow, how can we continue this? What's the possibility of comparing them without changing the character of specific processes? And I think this is a very big challenge. There's a question from the internet. Do you want me to read it? Yes. Odailson Regis de Oliveira is asking Marcelo whether the institutionalization generates demobilization and how you assess the attempt of the federal government to establish a national policy for social participation. He is a student in the graduate program of the Federal University of Paraíba, I think. Thanks.
They're very interesting questions. I think that I agree with most of them. The aesthetic key is extremely important, not only in Brazil, but also abroad. Designs were very important in the US. I think that the art and aesthetics allow people to have a different kind of relationship with political actions that in a way helps to mobilize, creates a sense of meaning. I wouldn't know. Funny, when we discuss the Occupy in the States, usually it's something very disputed because everybody believes that Occupy, more or less, is no longer as it used to be. But that does not mean that it did not reach certain goals. The so-called 99%, for instance, got into the public discourse in the States, where it's very difficult to talk about inequality. We have a mayor, a left-wing mayor for North American standards, who carried the banner of the Occupy, of the 99%. I think that the issues raised, all of them point towards a need to think carefully about the relationship between movements and institutions, political parties. I think that it would be also, I'm going to mention our work at Marcelo, and our great friend Patrick Ella did a few years ago, trying to think about these relationships of movements with municipal administrations, to try to identify some relationships. I agree with the feeling it has various typologies that change over time. In the specific case of the Workers' Party of PT, the dynamics that we saw during the World Social Forum of a non-instrumental relationship with civil society, which was a model, is different from the one that existed a few years before with the Forum of São Paulo, which is understand it's different from the version of the double power, and it continues to change. So we have to deal with these relationships very carefully. And thinking now about the relationships of movements with parties or governments, there are various possibilities. One thing that we did a big effort at that time to think about when we developed that work, there were relationships of movements with governments in which the movements were quite independent also in material terms, but they did maintain an autonomy. Sometimes Luciana said that the autonomy is not lack of relationship, so there are relationships that were in a way autonomous, but there was a dependence in material terms. So we have to think carefully about the meanings, about the financial relationships, about the ability of movements to generate their own agendas, for instance. But this is the way to go. These would be my general comments. I think the one challenge is to make progress in the construction of typologies that are able to apprehend this complexity. I think that there are already typologies who have the ability and the obligation to make progress in the formulation of these typologies that grasp the complexities and specificities of each case so that they can create a gradient of the various possibilities of relationship. And basically that we face a big challenge. Why do relationships change over time? Why have these relationships been, that standard of relationship, pattern of relationship that we had in the beginning of the 1980s, when all these, well, a whole set of movements and social organizations, and at the same time a political organization is born out of the same process, is a fruit of the same process, that form a certain kind of relationship, which is obviously not the kind of relationship that we have now in 2014. So these relationships underwent significant changes. And I try to argue that perhaps part of what we are watching, part of the reason for our perplexity is that the relationships have changed significantly. In other words, we have to analyze this process why the patterns of relationship change seems to be important, in my view. And here, the work of Anish dealt with also with an important aspect is the issue of generational cohorts. We see that he's in discussions at university. The imaginary, to use a phrase used by Gianpaolo, is completely different from the imaginary of the standard activist of the 1980s. And Nish put it herself. Thales mentioned the anti-party and the non-party. She said in the beginning of the 80s, in this room here, many of you, perhaps most of you, would have a star of the Workers' Party on the chest. So it was a reason of pride to affirm one's political party identity publicly. You went to meetings of the student movement using an emblem of your political party, and it was not seen as a problem, but her work shows that it is a problem in the 1990s. Although everybody knows, nobody talks about the identification or connection with political parties. One can see that also in organizations. People usually ask about the connection about political parties, and the activists always say we are autonomous. Nobody claims they are dependent from a government or political party. And we also share these imaginaries, and sometimes we buy into them. But the reason for the change and the identification of the various patterns of identification. In this way, you organize the forms of constitution of the organizational and mobilization processes is one of the issues that we have to deal with in order to advance in our research agenda. Gabriel raised the issue of this diversity of agendas. One of the surprising things last year, so I never attended a demonstration in which there were from anarchists moving to PSTU, Sol Party, PT, PDT, Missouri, two groups and parties in the same demonstration. Never in my life had I seen such a demonstration, which, depending on the position occupied in the demonstration, you were in one kind of demonstration or in another one. If you were up in the front, it was a demonstration of a certain group. If you were in the middle, it was a different one. If you were at the lateral part, it was a different one. If you were in the front, there's people who, if they had a chance, would plunder something, would sack something. All of that you had in one of the same event. And all these agendas were on the table, but they were separated. Even in the marches themselves. In Porto Alegre, we had a moment when a certain left-wing sector decided to regain the control of the militant process, and the people of the landless movements, trade unions, come with a jersey to show who gives the commands here, and other people says, what are these people doing in our demonstration? This is not their demonstration. So this kind of dispute took place on the streets. And part of the speed of the decline had to do with the response by some groups that it was no longer wanted to take part in this kind of mixed demonstration. What I find very interesting and surprising is how that which seemed to be completely outside of institutional politics in the elections of 2014 is completely connected to a dynamics of the electoral dispute. Of course, they went apart afterwards. I think this is also something that makes our process more difficult. Doubtless, there is the issue of occupation. I think occupation is a performance, or whatever, that's circulated, and it's more... Well, Brazil already has an old trajectory of occupation by the social movements, by the struggle for land and for housing, but it gained new meanings, and the occupation of the municipal chamber in Porto Alegre, the city council had a whole symbology and implication, connection with other processes and other places. But why do some of them catch and others don't? Why do some manage to respond to this imagining and others don't? For instance, the right-wing demonstration in 2005, at the height of the Mensalão corruption scandal, there was an attempt to produce a very similar process of demonstration. You can look at YouTube, very interesting, you can see videos on that. People bullying others. At that time, Orkut was the social network, but it didn't catch that attempt at mobilization. In Porto Alegre, there was a demonstration, maybe with half a dozen people at the airport. But it didn't catch. In 2013, at least, a part of the mobilization has to do with these sectors who were already there, but we didn't see them. We didn't take them seriously. We drew a caricature of them, but they exhibited a relative ability of mobilization. Why certain practices are created at certain points and at other moments not, this is our challenge. To understand this is our challenge as social scientists. And the issue that Adailson raised, the relation between mobilization and institutionalization. Now, this is a relationship of which there is no standard, no pattern. There are dynamics. Donatella was mentioning this, and Dieter mentioned that there are moments, but there is a clear separation between parties and movements, state and movements. The Brazil in the military dictatorship, the participation or the institutional integration of left-wing movements was extremely limited or practically impossible. And there are other moments where there is a very strong intersection, so the variation is there. And I think that the policy of social participation, which was recently defeated at Congress, which exists in practice, we have the management councils do exist, it tries to articulate and to advance in something that was an important mark of our redemocratization. It has to do with what I mentioned this morning. The important thing is not to leave it aside. Today that means a significant space of social action of an important part of the Brazilian associative world. A part of the people who are on the streets belong to these associations, and the question is how do we integrate these things into our models of analysis and leave the either-or position behind us. Is there any additional question from the internet? Should we finish? Should we take one more round, mini round of questions? Are there further questions? Now, Alicia is asking for the floor. Anybody else? Her mic is off. Her mic is off. Sorry, the interpreter can't hear.
Wave of creative mechanisms where individuals can be more open and individual. Don't know what you think about this in this policy of not creation, because it wasn't created from one minute to another, the national system of participation and process, but this formulation has not served the voices on the street, so it's reproducing a model that I think is rather limited in trying to recompose these plural voices and also individual ideas. It's more an issue to think about. Anyone else? Would you like to say something? What Alicia said? No. I fully agree. Very brutally, I was also surprised because there's so many channels for participation in Brazil. Why is there a surplus of voices and rules that are not included or that do not feel listened to by these channels? It's impressive, I think. Also, something that I'm not the only one to say, make remarks on this. We were a bit surprised how the associativism also seemed not to be able to meet what these voices want. There were strong organizations, but also many aspirations still that we could perceive from afar. Anyhow, maybe Ernesto has a sentence. He says that people think that that solution is solution, but democracy is more democracy, and maybe that's how we go. But I agree. When you were talking, I teach generally to also students who are just entering social sciences. 7 in the morning, 7 in the evening, and I ask who knows the Council of Political Public Policies or conferences, participatory budget. 1 or 2 hands raised. I would also speak about space of participation, but there's a considerable level of lack of knowledge in civil society. Maybe that is related to this that we are seeing. We see a lot, and the actors are mobilized, they help build it, but there's lots of people who are frighteningly uninformed. No. A study we performed in Salvador, Bahia, in 2007, 2008, there were several participatory processes. If you read the folders of the city administration of Salvador, there were lots of things, so we decided to start by the suburbs, by the neighborhoods, and not by the city administration. We went to people who did macumba and all that. No one knew what it was. People thought that we were going to bring funds from the Ford Foundation, but the participatory budget, they had not the least idea. This sort of concern feeds this concern that I have that that there's a critical distance, because it's true. And in terms of generation, for instance, I who come from outside, I come here regularly, and I see that the young people of 15 years ago are no longer the young people of today with rules and so on. I don't know whether the political project of the Workers' Party really can cover this. extent there seems to be something missing? No. What? It's an obvious complexity, and this issue of lack of knowledge is very real, but it seems that we have to take into account, for instance, the lack of knowledge of the electorate regarding its representatives, and in fact the memory of whom they voted for is the same and even greater. So I think the matter is much more to what extent this participatory institutionality can really respond to questions, issues and demands, agreeing fully with the idea that all of this institutionality has to be valued, that should not be forgotten, but a National Conference on Health, a National Council on Health, so on does not have the power of, at least does not have the power of defining whether the country should increase the percentage and change the policies for health and so on. Just as the issue of mobility, in other words, there are very serious limitations in these participatory channels. In fact, the current literature is talking a lot more about the efficacy and quality of participation. So agreeing with this, I think that to understand this process and what happened last year, we also need to understand the limitations of this framework, this institutional framework of participation. One more. My name is Felipe, and I'd like to first of all thank the panel. My question is to Marcelo, but I invite Professor Gianpaolo to answer if he wants to help answer. Marcelo, you said something about the porosity of interaction between government and some social movements, and the character that can be both positive and negative in this porosity for the social movements. And it seems to me that there's another important issue about this porosity, that if we consider the patrimonial history of Brazil, especially during the empire, we perceive that this inherited patrimonialism together with the coalition presidentialism, which is our current model of election, also contaminates the party identity. And the voters, you can see that the voters of the Workers' Party often have stopped voting because, as Professor Gianpaolo said, we can't see the government as a substance, as a game of complex relationships. And this presidentialism with coalitions, in my opinion, removes the voice of the parties in a way, or changes it. Anyhow, my question is, considering this patrimonialist inheritance and this coalition government presidentialism, which is often considered irresponsible for the lack of efficiency of our executive, because one negotiates jobs which are often given to people who do not manage to really carry them out as those positions of trust, as was mentioned before. The problem of party identity and the crisis of political representation, finally, can be solved by participation mechanism, or can they, or will there be a case of changing, reforming all of the political organization of our state? Carlos going to be last, and then we have to close. Oh, rather reflection and the sharing, and I think it goes along the line that he mentioned, which began yesterday with Professor Alessandro's state, which is up to what point democracy dialogues with capitalist production mode. I don't know whether yesterday in the documentary by Professor Dieter, he touched on the thing that when the activist puts it on the point of view of socialism, of another way of living in society. I don't know whether it's the panel that has to answer, but in the event I propose to discuss civil society, democracy and contestation in the condition of Brazil and Latin America. To what extent does our democratic state dialogue with the capitalist system, and if it's possible, how we can mediate these social differences according to the object that he mentioned of this patrimonialism? Because by saying that, in my opinion, the participatory institutions end up being the space of those who do not have a voice and also do not really manage to make the demands. It is a participation in the form of listening. So, but it's not a real fiction to continue debating, but think to what point contestation does not want to break with this mode of production that generates these inequalities. But just a thought.
Well, these are several questions, several topics, and I'd like to begin by referring to what Ligia said. In general, we were thinking here a lot about the issue of participation. The very idea of participation in Brazil is related to the participation of civil society, of social organizations, participation of those who are organized, those who are activists, militants of social organizations. Yesterday, in the video itself, when you saw the trajectory, the history of the activists, these are activists that have a whole trajectory, history of permanent involvement. But one of the big issues that last year raised is an activity which is individualized, it is particular, ephemeral, highly dynamic, but which can be very significant when it manages to reach a certain scale, as we saw last year. Now, this kind of activism, this all-over participatory institutional design offers absolutely nothing to these individuals who want. So the whole discussion about Lance Bennett, about a discussion about a new connected individualism, about an activist who no longer identifies with organization, is much more connected through networks, who is not existentially devoted to a cause. I think all of that will have to rethink. The very active pattern or standard of activism is changing. So a whole institutional design built having as a reference a certain kind of social organization, a certain form of collective action may perhaps be disappearing, or at least it has other competitors that are emerging. This is a challenge for us. Another important issue is the fact that participation also involves this construction. In the research project that Gianpaolo referred to, one of the things that we saw that marked the experiences of participatory budgeting is how the social organizations, through their mediation work, built that connection between populations and the space of participation. So it reaches a very limited public. It's an audience that is within the area of influence of this kind of associativism, and the polls show that in terms of percentage of the population, this is a quite small number of people who really do have this kind of associative involvement. We ourselves, if you were to ask around here in the room, what do we know about these, I don't know how many dozens of conferences that took place, who has an idea? Well, of course, there are conferences that mobilize a lot of people, but let's say conference on health. The immense majority, I myself, don't even have an idea when they take place, in which way, and so forth. So that depends a lot on the work of these mediators of organizations that play that role. And we discuss very little about mediation. And in an unequal society like ours, we should have very segmented worlds, a lot of segregation, spatial, social, racial segregation. It's essential to define who participates, who doesn't, who identifies with the spaces of participation, and so forth. Felipe? Where is Felipe? You raise the issue of the porosity. Now, at the moment, I think I used the word in a negative or positive sense. Of course, I do have my own views about this, but I think that one of our great difficulties are these labeling. It should be this or that, which often prevents us, through which we avoid the much more difficult work of really understanding what is going on. It may not be what I like, but which sometimes leads me to a certain methodological difficulty. I think this morning someone said that we don't research, for instance, our world of studies of social movements. Nobody researches, not in the world of participation, nobody researches the mobilization, intervention of elite sectors of the business community, dominating sectors of society. That's, for us, is despised by us, but it's essential for us to understand these dynamics. Of course, there is a methodological problem. How do we reach them? How do we get to them? But this is a challenge for us, to really understand the participatory and associative dynamics that transcends many borders of our world of ideological and political affinities. We should we should ask seriously why someone is mobilized to ask for a military intervention. Of course, I don't agree with that, but what makes such an individual go to the streets with such a poster in the year 2014 and ask for a military intervention? What logic, what structural organization, what meaning does that action have? Before we judge, because it seems that the condemnation exempts us from investigating that, and this is another challenge for us. One last thing, the issue of crisis. This is generalized. We have crisis of representation, crisis of participation, crisis of the movements. There's another term, so to say. It seems that everything is in crisis in Brazil. In particular, we have the logic of crisis. We love a crisis. But the crisis cannot be permanent. What is permanent is our way of being. So crisis for me is a word that representative institutions are in crisis, someone said at our latest meeting. But I don't see any crisis. People are talking about crisis, but this is the way our institutions work. That's the dynamic. Now, the participatory dimensions are supposedly in crisis because they are representations. Are they in a crisis? I don't think so. So I think we should be careful about the word crisis because it's very seductive for us Brazilians who have a life in which crises have always been present. And I think these words can lead us to certain interpretations that are not the most correct ones. Nothing? So that's okay. I would like to thank for the participation of all of you. Particularly, I would like to thank Gianpaolo and Marcelo. So we will be back at 6:30. The session from 6:30 to 8, we will talk about protests, police and violence, with talks by Donatella Della Porta and Rodrigo Guiringelli de Azevedo, with a narration of Raul Rocha. Have a good day.